This video is introducing you to basic anatomy and physiology. Within here, we want to talk about what is anatomy, get to know what we mean by anatomy and physiology and why they matter in conjunction, and why we study them in conjunction. What defines something as living, and how is the human body organized? We're going to learn a few key important things about anatomy and physiology, as well as talk a little bit about that anatomy that's covered in lab. And then finally, we're going to discuss things like homeostasis. So anatomy and physiology work in conjunction with each other. Anatomy studies the structures of the body. Physiology studies the functions of those structures. So they go in conjunction with each other. For instance, your heart, we can study the anatomy of the heart by looking at how the heart is shaped, what it's made of, its different membranes, its cavities, its different ventricles and atrium, the veins and the arteries that run through it, etc., etc. And then on top of that, we look at why those things matter. Why is the heart shaped the way that it is? It has a specific purpose and function to be shaped like that. Why is it composed of that muscle tissue that you study in the anatomy? Because the muscle tissue is contractible and so therefore can pump the heart. So anatomy and physiology, when we do the general class, we're looking at basic anatomy of the 11 different organ systems of the body, and then the basic function of how those 11 organ systems work to maintain everything in homeostasis. There are different types of anatomy that are studied. There is systemic anatomy, which examines the human body by looking at individual organ systems. So for instance, studying just the respiratory system, or just the cardiovascular system, or just the skeletal system. Regional anatomy studies body regions, so things like the abdominal pelvic area, or just the head and neck, or just the arms, or just the legs. Surface anatomy studies specific surface markings of the body. And we have gross anatomy, which is going to observe different structures that you can see with the unaided eye, which means gross anatomy basically looks at things that are visible to you. So large muscles of the body, the bones that can easily be seen, the skin, etc. While microscopic anatomy is actually looking at those things that are too tiny to be easily visible. And this includes things like the study of tissues and the study of cells. Some of these things will be studied completely individually of others and fall within their own branches. And there are scientists and doctors who only study a piece of this. However, there are also doctors who are going to look at broader things. For instance, in systemic anatomy, if you're studying an organ system, you also have to know about some surface anatomy and some gross anatomy and some microscopic anatomy. So some of these can fall kind of in conjunction with each other. Just like there's different types of anatomy, there's also different types of physiology. Remembering, of course, that physiology is studying the function of those structures. So in physiology, we can study particular areas like neurophysiology, studies just the nervous system. So it's looking at the brains and the nerves. Cardiovascular physiology would only study the heart and the blood vessels. There are other levels of organization, like looking at chemical and cellular processes and looking at specific tissues and organs within the body. All right, so we keep talking about the human body, but what makes the human body part of a living organism? How do we define what makes up a living organism? And why does this matter? Because anatomy and physiology actually falls under the umbrella called biology, and biology is the study of life. There are key characteristics that determine what makes something living versus non-living. So these are the basic characteristics that you have to have in order to be considered living. And you must contain all of them to be considered living. If you're missing one, then it's considered that you are non-living. You must be composed of at least one cell. you must have metabolism, which means that you are able to conduct chemical reactions within yourself as an organism. And it doesn't matter if you are one cell big, like a bacteria, or you are multicellular, like a human being. Bacteria conduct chemical reactions all the time. They make energy, they use energy, they expend energy. Human beings do this all the time as well. You have to be able to grow and develop. You have to be able to excrete. Excretion means the removal of waste from the body. Humans do removal of waste from the body in various ways, through your skin, through your urine, and through your feces are the most common types. You have to have responsiveness, which is the ability to respond to a certain type of stimulus. And this can be almost any type of stimulus. For instance, you see something scary and you decide to run away. This would be a response to stimulus. It's cold outside and you start to shiver. That's a response to stimulus. It's hot outside, so you decide to wear shorts and you sweat. All different types of stimulus. Bacteria have stimulus as well. Plants have stimulus as well. So while a plant can up and run away or decide to put on a coat or decide to put on shorts, plants have other ways. They're not getting enough water. They might decide to reduce the amount of processes that they're doing. They might decide to grow their roots longer to try to find more water. They might do things like drop leaves to avoid expending too much water through photosynthesis. And some plants, or many plants, will start to grow or move towards the sunlight as well. All responses to stimuli. Movement is the ability of any organism to be able to move substances in or out of the cells. So if I'm a bacteria, which is only one cell big, I have to have the ability to move substances in and out of me. We already learned with the cell that the plasma membrane is going to determine what moves in and out of a cell. And so movement in and out of a cell is an example of a key characteristic of life. A lot of times we hear movement and we think, well, plants don't move or a fungus doesn't move. It's not movement in the ability to get up and walk somewhere, but instead to have things move through your cells. And then reproduction is our last one. And this is the ability to create more of the same species. All right. So there are different organization, or I should say there are different levels of organization within living organisms. Okay. So the basic unit of matter is the atom. And you can see that down here. This is your basic unit of matter. It is the atom. But the basic unit of life is going to be the cell. So while the basic unit of matter is the atom, you have to have at least one cell to be alive. We just saw this in the characteristics of living organisms. Again, doesn't matter if you're unicellular or multicellular, as long as you have at least one cell. If you are multicellular, then cells will make up tissues. Tissues will make up organs. Organs can make up organ systems, and organ systems make up the entire organism. Human being is a great example of a multicellular organism in which we are made out of billions of cells that are organized into tissues, and many types of tissues working together for a common function are called an organ. Many organs working together for a common function is an organ system. And all the organ systems together make up who we are as a human being. Throughout this class, we are going to look at the 11 organ systems that make up the human being. In Anatomy and Physiology 1, we look at just 4 of those organ systems. The other 7 organ systems we'll look at in Anatomy and Physiology 2. All right, so in lab, you're going to cover a good number of material for the introduction to anatomy and physiology. This is basically what we're doing is you're all going into the health field. So we're forming your base, like the base of a pyramid. And as you progress through your different disciplines and programs, you're just going to be adding to that base and adding to that base until finally you've created everything that you need to know to be a professional in the field. But here's where you start A&P. And this can be a little bit daunting because there's so much to cover in A&P, but that's because it is the key foundation onto which everything else will develop. In lab, you're going to look at what it means by anatomical position. And this is when your body looks like this. This is anatomical position. The body with the hands facing forward, face facing forward, legs slightly apart, and feet flat on the ground, or at least the soles downwards, right? So this is the classic anatomical position. So when we're doing things like describing the body, using directional terms, body regions, body cavities, etc., we are always considering the body in anatomical position. Even if you were looking at a patient, that patient at that moment is not in the anatomical position, you still describe them as if they were in anatomical position. You will understand what are directional terms and be able to identify different structures or organs within the human body by their directional term and anatomical position. You'll learn what are the body regions and body cavities and why they matter, why we study body regions and body cavities, why you need to know this. You're also going to learn the abdominal pelvic quadrants and divisions. And you're also going to learn about those organ systems briefly, those 11 organ systems. You're going to be able to name all 11 and know some key function of each of those 11 organ systems, plus key organs found within each organ system. So for instance, understanding that the nervous system is in charge of sending electrical messages throughout the body, and that it is composed of nerves, brain, and spinal cord. And understanding that your cardiovascular system is in charge of distributing nutrients and oxygen via the blood to different parts of your body. And so therefore it's going to involve things like blood vessels in your heart. And then finally, you'll also learn about planes of section and why those matter. I'm not going to go into the anatomy of all of these because this is something you're going to cover in lab. But for lecture, we are going to talk a little bit briefly about some of these things. So you learn about surface anatomy, body cavities, body regions, abdominal pelvic quadrants, etc. And it matters because when a clinician is going to look at someone, say a patient comes into the hospital and is complaining about pain in their abdominal pelvic area, you want to be able to diagnose what is happening to this patient. But patients can be notoriously bad at saying exactly what they're feeling. It's going to be very rare that you're going to have a patient come in and say, well, I've got an ulcer on my stomach that is flamed up and causing pain. Unless that's something common they already have and already been diagnosed with an ulcer. Instead, they'll come in, maybe screaming or bent over, and they say everything hurts. Where, I don't know, all here, and they just point at their entire abdomen. So here's where you're going to be using those quadrants and regions and directions that you learn in lab to be able to hopefully pinpoint where the aching and the pain is to determine what is the injury or disease or problem that is causing it. Your planes of section are going to be very important for things like CT and MRIs. These scans are utilized to help determine these things here. And in order to be able to look more closely at something, so say a person comes in and they have pain towards the back of their body, but in the abdominal pelvic area, when you palpitate, then it might be the kidneys. And so one of the things you can do is then do a CT or MRI scan of the kidney to see if there's any abnormalities, tumor, stone, anything that shows up within it. So the planes of section are utilized for making cuts to visualize the internal organs and structures without actually having to do surgery on the patient. All right, your body cavities, which you learn about in lab, are those spaces that hold your organs. They're important because they protect those delicate organs from shock and impact, and they permit significant changes in size and shape of those internal organs. So think about your stomach. Your stomach is actually quite small, but it can grow in size every time you eat because it can expand. If your body cavity didn't allow for the expansion of the stomach, you would get full with just one glass of water. So therefore, changes in size and shape are going to be extremely important. Your internal organs, your internal organs are called viscera. So this is what we call the internal organs of your body, viscera, just commonly, or also called visceral organs. Okay, and your visceral organs, which are those internal organs, they're not just floating in your body. They actually have to be set in a specific space without banging into each other and without moving all about. And the way it's able to do this is by having these cavities protected by certain things. So a good example would be your heart. Your heart has something called a pericardial cavity that helps protect it. So here is your heart, which is this organ, but the organ is surrounded by this, which is a pericardial cavity. And this pericardial cavity is going to help absorb impact, help keep the heart in place, and keep it from getting injured. All right. So what are these cavities actually composed of? Well, let's start with these body cavities, like your pericardial cavity that we just looked at, the one that covers the heart, are going to contain something called serous membranes. These membranes are what lines that body cavity. So the pericardial cavity is then lined by this serous membrane. And serous membranes will be composed of three things. So you can see it here. This is your, this is your serous membrane called your pericardial cavity that is going to protect that heart. And so it's going to be composed of three things: a parietal layer, a visceral layer, and a serous fluid. The visceral layer is the innermost layer because it will lie right up against the heart. The parietal layer is going to be the outermost layer. It's what forms the outermost part of this membrane, and it's what also attaches it to the rest of the body to keep it from just flopping about. And then all within it is going to be filled with a specific type of fluid called serous fluid. And the serous fluid is going to help lubricate it and keep it from getting too much friction to cause damage as it's doing whatever it is that it needs to do. So when you're jumping up and down, when you're moving, when your heart is beating, your heart is not getting scraped against the other organs or against its own membrane. Okay. These membranes will always have those three parts: a parietal layer, a visceral layer, and then the fluid within it. There are three main types of serous membranes. We just talked about one of them, your pericardial one, right? So that's one of your main ones. Your pleural is another one. So the pleural membrane is the one that surrounds the lungs. And you can see it here in this image. These here is your right lung and your left lung. And it's going to be protected by that membrane, which is called your pleural membrane. And of course, it's going to have the innermost part, which is called the visceral pleura, sitting right here. The outermost part, which is called the parietal pleura, right here. And in between is going to be the serous fluid, located in between the parietal and the visceral. Your heart, as we saw in the image before, is protected by the pericardial membrane, or pericardial sac, it's also called. Again, you're going to have your innermost layer, which is called, right up against here, which is called your visceral layer, then your parietal layer, and in between is that pericardial fluid, that serous fluid. And the third main type you have is your peritoneal membrane. Your peritoneal membrane includes almost all of the rest of your abdominal pelvic organs. So your stomach, your kidney, not your kidneys, your stomach, your liver, your small intestine, your large intestine, all of them will form part of the peritoneal membrane. Okay, or they will be covered by peritoneal membrane. And again, they'll have the parietal, the visceral, and then the fluid in between the two. Right, I'm going to leave it here. The next part of the video is just going to be talking about homeostasis.